as you can see, we have a very important speaker today from RMIT, Australia, who is going to be talking about resilient recovery after disasters. What lessons have we learned post-disaster reconstruction across 3 decades in different countries? Wow, I'm excited. Even I'm looking forward to learning from Mittul today. So today's agenda, I'll do the welcome and acknowledgement of country, followed by the introduction of the speaker. Then we'll allow the speaker to make a presentation, followed by a 15-minute Q&A, and then we'll give you an update on the coming events, and then we'll close the meeting. So I want to try as much as possible to be on time today. I will suggest that while the presenter is going on, or before she starts her presentation, if you have questions, please post it on the Q&A so that we can easily grab it, and then we can ask her while after she's presenting. But we're also going to give an opportunity for everyone to ask questions live after she's finished. So to do the acknowledgement of the country, first I would like to start by acknowledging the Awakaba people as a traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining today at the University of Newcastle Callahan campus is located. I also acknowledge that many of you are joining from different lands across Australia and beyond. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and imagine and extend the respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We recognize that First Nation sovereignty was never ceded. This land always was and will always be Aboriginal land. And I will introduce our speaker. Dr. Mittul Vahanvati, hope I don't butcher your name so much here, Mittul. She's a program manager and a senior lecturer at RMIT College of Design and Social Context here in Australia, in Victoria. She's recognized for improving housing resilience to disasters through responsive governance, capacity building for all key stakeholders through post-disaster recovery and interventions. Mittul is trained as an architect, originally trained as an architect and practiced in the industry for over 8 years, and has developed several applied research projects with industry partners, policymakers, and practitioners to inform building policies, construction codes, technical assets, resilience, and community resilience in the context of India, Solomon Islands, and Australia, where we'll be hearing from her today. Practically, she's done this work across 2 continents and then across 3 countries. I think it's much more than that if you have read her book, but she'll be presenting today in the context of India, Solomon Islands, and Australia. Join me to welcome Dr. Mittul while I give her the grounds to start our presentation.
Thank you for the invite, Tammy, and the CIB. I would also like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Bunwurrung language groups, people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, as the traditional custodians of the land on which I work, live, teach, and learn. I also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I continue to unlearn the colonial structures in which I myself was educated. So what does resilient recovery mean? I'm going to talk about the book that was recently published with 2 co-authors. But to my surprise, it took us 5 years to work on it. Like it was like another PhD. When we were about to launch the book, we realized that UNDRR has also, their latest conference was also termed as Resilient Recovery, which came as a real surprise, but also interesting coincidence. So what does resilience mean for whom? Of course, for the people who are disaster affected. Resilience of what? We were interested in the housing system, and I'll talk more about what we mean by that. And resilience to what? Against all disruptions, and a multi-hazards approach rather than a single hazard approach. Resilience when and where, that spatial and geographical aspect of resilience, as well as the temporal dimension of resilience. So we focused on post-disaster reconstruction in that book, but we also acknowledge that resilience building and capacity building is an ongoing process. It never stops. But how was the biggest question. So the key gap we felt was that, yes, we understand there is a need for radical systemic change for us to adapt to the challenges we face in terms of disaster risk and due to climate change. So if we look at it from a post-disaster context, the disaster event, its severity, its frequency, how long does it last, whether it had element of surprise, what sort of resources the government had, all those pre-existing conditions and the hazard determines how much impact does it have, but also then the reconstruction process in terms of what is mobilized determines whether it will be a resilient recovery after 7-10 years. Most research was around stopped after about 5 years after a disaster, and attention goes elsewhere. Media attention only stays on a disaster for the first couple of weeks and for a month, maybe at the latest. So we were interested in figuring out what are the key factors, catalyzing factors that help or hinder systemic changes required for resilient recovery. We distinguish resilient recovery from recovery because resilience, the term itself, it is a process and an outcome which is continual. It requires that continual learning from the past disaster recoveries or responses and apply them to subsequent ones to transform and improve upon for reducing vulnerability and risk. Recovery can be grouped into these two buckets, where it can lead to minor improvement in the current conditions, or can retain pre-existing vulnerabilities. So these factors were what we were trying to identify. But why? Why is there a need for identifying temporal dimension of disasters? Resilience building, most of you might be aware, it is a Latin term which means bouncing back. And bouncing back or bouncing forward, there's a lot of discussion around that. However, the idea is that it focuses on ability and the capacity of people, of communities, of government to do something about the risks they see are going to be facing them in the near future. And there are some pre-existing risk conditions we call vulnerabilities in the current times. So temporally, the risk is not stagnant. It constantly keeps increasing or can be reduced if there is proactive measures put into place. Politically, it is not attractive to put money for risk reduction before a disaster. Majority of the funding goes into post-disaster response and recovery to some extent. However, very little money goes before disaster, and hence our focus on a recovery. And as we all know, recovery is a long process. Recovery is not just of the physical buildings, road infrastructure. It is of one's livelihood, of mental health issues that the trauma might have caused. So resilience is about whether the capacities of that whole system has increased or not. And how can we see that, whether it's improved or not? By seeing what has happened in subsequent disaster. So we have seen or been researching not one disaster, but two in one country. So when I say we, these are my co-authors. I met Liz Mali at IREC conference in 2019, and we struck a chord while discussing. We felt there is a need for us to work together, and because we were working in very similar areas. And as three female scholars, it is intentional to be three female scholars. We bring objectivity, and we hope to include a gendered perspective on care and capabilities in disaster recovery space. My PhD topic was also on post-disaster housing reconstruction and how it improves people's lives in the long term after two major disastrous events, one earthquake and one floods in case of India. I didn't publish a book from my PhD, and I didn't want to just go about republishing my PhD. So I decided to compare India with two other countries which are at different development stage, and that's where the idea of the book. Over time, as I said, I've worked in Solomon Islands, and all centered around disaster risk reduction through housing or nature-based solutions, or through indigenous knowledges, surfacing or amplifying indigenous knowledges. So this book, this is how it is structured. My research, having focused initially on Indian context, which is a lower middle income country. If we want to see whether risk reduction is embedded in ongoing development activities, we wanted to bring in three countries from different development stage as per the classification by the World Bank. And hence we reached out to Titaya, who is from Thailand, as middle income or upper middle income country to fit between India and Japan. And each country, there are two case studies, which we compare in the last chapter. So the first chapter sets out the scene of housing, which is a physical asset. How can we think of it as a multidimensional asset, or as we call it, housing as a system within a system? So considering housing the decisions for the house are made by the residents living within, but are also affected by a plethora of issues in terms of the local policies supporting poor or land rights of informal settlements, as well as the construction standards, how they are enforced. It also provides the first buffer for safety against weather events, and it can reduce sensitivity in the context of disaster risk if it is built well. But then if we think that housing has a role to play in climate resilient development, it is one small element in the whole system, the human system, the climate change, and the ecosystem. What is the role of the housing from the lens of housing rights and housing resilience? So we need to frame housing as a system, but how do we do that? And that is what the first chapter tries to grapple with, developing this framework of housing is, yes, a technical and physical asset, but it is determined by the political system, the ecological system, what is available, what is the climate, how it needs to be designed, the financial system, and the social values. But yes, that is a system, and there is the water, sewage, all of that mechanical systems running through the house. So, and the house doesn't exist in isolation. One needs roads and other infrastructure around. So that way it is embedded within a system, but yes, it is a system in itself. What is its link with resilience characteristics? We identified resilience characteristics from scholars, and when we say resilience, we looked at the socio-ecological systems resilience, SES resilience, and what are its relationship to the housing system. That interlink was created in the first chapter, and as you can see here, there is description of those resilience elements in relation to the housing and settlement characteristics. So this geographic and temporal dimension, coming back to that, disasters and development are not separate, yet they are in silo. In most countries, including in Australia, the entire housing system is managed and governed by different authorities compared to those managing disaster risk or recovery. So there is a big divide between the two. But for resilient recovery, that divide ought to be broken, or there needs to be integration. And hence we traced historic pathways of how the development narrative, as well as the housing reforms from the UN bodies and global bodies, interweaved with each other. And what does that mean for resilient recovery? How are these countries, India, Thailand, and Japan, classified as per their GDP level, as different development level countries, are addressing the challenges of housing reconstruction? Does their development status have any implications on how they navigate reconstruction? And what difference does their development status have on their abilities to recover? What sort of programs they are developing, what practices, and what are its long-term outcomes? Sorry. Wait. Not sure why this is... okay. So these are the, within India, again, the same case studies, however, different locations within, urban and rural. So as for more comparability, again, rural and urban, similarly, floods, tsunami, earthquake, tsunami, and earthquake, as well as earthquake and flood. So there were some comparable disasters we focused on. We looked back to disasters, maximum 30-ish years, from 14 to 30-ish years, each of these disasters. The temporal dimension, we looked at pre-disaster housing context, as in the culture of housing, not just the type of houses built, but the culture. Explain specific disasters noted here, what were its impact, and what policies and programs were developed by the government. What was implemented? What was the result of housing reconstruction? How long did it take? How much? This is the duration we have listed here. And what are the outcomes at least 10 years after that disaster? In case of India, after the 2001 Gujarat earthquake, which was one of the second most deadliest earthquake in India's history, affecting over 1 million people, million households, I must say, million houses. This urban center applied, the government adopted an owner-driven reconstruction at scale for the first time. And this is the second country in the world who adopted owner-driven housing reconstruction. Now it has become a standard approach after most most disasters, but India was the second country who has adopted this approach, and at such a large scale in urban, rural, and regional areas. Looking at it from 24 years since, what we witness is, in terms of physical assets, the houses that were built compared to what used to exist, as you can see in the slides, stone construction with mud mortar, no cement in it. This is the temporary shelters, and then these are the houses. They were clustered in the cluster of 20 houses with a courtyard in the middle. They are robust. It has improved the quality of life of people. These people used to live in unsafe homes and didn't even have land rights, many of them. So the renters and weaker socioeconomic groups were also given land and housing rights with certain requirements, of course, conditions. However, for some people, land rights and access to infrastructure continues to remain challenging. On some relocation sites, the government promised them roads, buses, yet that took more than 10 years to be established. The one key learning here is that in India, caste system is a huge concern, and people value who they live next to, and religion and caste. In the early days, the NGO who helped implement this project were taking consensus from people. Who do you want your neighbors to be? And there would be groups, clusters of 20 who would be from the same religion. But after a certain point, it became so complex that they just started using a ballot system or just lucky draw and putting people into these houses as whatever came out of the draw. And that has created a lot of issues, and people have been moving out. They were not supposed to sell their homes for 25 years. However, they have started informally renting out or reselling to other people. In context of the Northeast India, at the foothills of Himalayas, which has a riverine system, this flood event was the first time when the government developed a comprehensive recovery plan. And they'd had no recovery experience or capacity because that had never been done. In the past, people were only given some money as a relief, and that's it. That was the only support people got. So again, owner-driven reconstruction strategy was adopted, a policy was adopted. And this time, because the government had no capacity, they invited a consortium of NGOs. Number of NGOs across India had joined hands to form an owner-driven reconstruction collaborative, ODRC. And they were brought in to build capacity of the government as well as help develop the policy. Such example has not been seen anywhere in the world by far. They adopted an agile two-staged recovery process where the process was a reconstruction process was implemented in 2 settlements, and after that it was fine-tuned that people here are so poor they cannot be asked to give in labor for free because otherwise their kids go hungry. So in the recovery assistance package, they had to put in labor charges and pay households who contributed labor to their own house construction. They came up with a decentralized system of managing the reconstruction process. So after 17 years after, yes, the homes are robust. What is interesting here is the traditional technologies also became institutionalized. There are now standards around bamboo construction, which the NGOs worked with civil engineers to develop, because that is what is available locally and what people can afford. They even had to calculate how many screws or the kilos of cement they could use in one house to ensure that people can maintain the house and extend upon it. The land rights of the poor and is inclusive. Those who didn't have land, the recovery actually ensured that they were given land by government subsidy. However, because there is no local presence of an NGO, which was the case in Gujarat, the people's compliance to standards and building safer construction is slipping away. Some skilled builders actually have started their own company and are spreading the word of how to build safer. So it is getting embedded in the culture. People themselves have knowledge of what is best practice and how to make risk-informed decisions. However, all of that is waning without any effort from the government or NGOs to keep up communities' knowledge and awareness. Their knowledge from 2008 floods is now waning. So what continued from 2001 to 2008 within Indian case studies, and what is potential, what has potential to be replicated elsewhere? One thing that continued is the owner-driven housing reconstruction. However, from 2001 to 2008, it became much more mature. While in 2001, government had public-private partnership, it was still very top-down governance model. NGOs were asked to adopt a village or an apartment and help communities rebuild. However, in 2008, they worked together with NGOs to understand what sort of program is suitable for specific location. So yes, the learnings were captured and adopted in other part of the Indian state. The civil society organizations and NGOs were mere implementers of construction. They didn't advise or advocate for policy or program. However, in 2008, they became advisors and advocates of owner-driven reconstruction policy. So there is a greater role for civil society organization. However, what we also found is that they need to be locally embedded. If they are fly in, fly out sort of NGO, then people's awareness and risk understanding starts waning, as we see in the case of Bihar. Everywhere there was pro-poor land rights front and center, and there was participatory planning of who will live where, and people had choice to make informed decision. So it wasn't just about what capacity building, but it was also capabilities approach, where people were given knowledge, awareness, and choice. So out of that choice, they could pick what they valued. And as Amartya Sen says, capabilities approach is allowing people to live a life they value. But for that, you need to have choice. You can't just say this is the only option you have. And social fabric, as I said, is super important in Indian context. By learning from the issues in 2001 urban areas, in 2008, the NGOs and the government asked the communities to decide where they want to live with who next to them. The Thai case study, I will have to just zoom past. The 2011 floods and 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. What we realized is that with mega disasters such as tsunami, so much money flows in that Thailand, the government, which adopts a very top-down approach, swayed towards builder-driven and donor-driven reconstruction. But when they don't have money, which is during after the floods, they move towards owner-driven reconstruction. So there is, with the middle-income country, what we found is that it sways towards what Japan does or what India does, depending on the resources they have available. The interesting thing, however, another interesting thing was that CODI, which is a government-formed organization, was established 20 years ago to help those who are poor or living in informal settlements. They were mobilized after the tsunami to help, again, poor with their housing recovery. And these groups are the ones who have highest satisfaction. Their homes are built not like a stamp or same model house repeated, but they were built by the people with the help of CODI. In Japan's case, 1995 Kobe earthquake was influential in bringing about a lot of changes and reforms, which still continue to be fine-tuned, but there were wholesale changes that happened after the Kobe earthquake. The other one was the 2011 Great Eastern Japan earthquake and sequence of tsunami, as which we looked into. 1995 Kobe earthquake was the largest urban scale disaster since World War II. So the government or the people had no precedents. What should be recovery policy? It was entirely government-led, top-down, and there were there was unprecedented level or scale of land readjustment, relocation, zoning of black, gray, and white zones, and there was a two-track recovery. Only the public housing or the vulnerable people who could not rebuild themselves were supported by the government. However, private homeowners were left to figure out their own recovery based on market-driven mechanisms. Insurance is not a big thing in Japan. So market-led mechanisms, some would have insurance, others wouldn't. And it is during 1995 that Machizukuri Ordinance was introduced to shape participatory planning, because there was a real lack of social inclusion, like participatory reconstruction. As you can see from this map, all the pink areas are land readjustment areas. The black ones are the newly developed areas, and there were different typologies of buildings that were built. When I say buildings, they are more public housing where vulnerable people can be accommodated. However, there were no streets or parks included at large scale. And as I said, participation was not included either. In 2011, the learnings from the past 1995 Kobe earthquake, where we can see that they were applied, and from their approach to land readjustment, the government moved towards collective relocation. So a settlement-based community, in 1995, they were moved into apartments based on without consultation with people. So many a times the local place-based community from a town got completely separated. However, that aspect was revised in 2011. It took about 4 years to be able to navigate the recovery after 2011. However, because government also was learning how to do participatory planning. So 14 years after, the government actually introduced also multiple diverse forms of public housing. In earlier case, they only had big towers and apartment dwelling, whereas after 14 years since in 2011, the government introduced a single family, multi-dwelling, medium density, standalone home, and tall apartment. And financial support was also extended to private homeowners in 2011. And they, as I said, they moved from land readjustment to collective relocation. So the whole settlement-based community could move together. And so to sum up what continued from 1995 to 2011 and what has potential to be sustained and built upon is, one is sustainable neighborhoods, keeping communities together, as well as giving some financial support to private homeowners, if not entirely rebuilt their homes, including diverse types of physical assets. And when it comes to land and where to live, having community involvement in their settlement planning. CSO or NGOs don't play a major role in Japan. That's not a big culture. However, some rural settlements, they organically developed Machizukuri for participatory planning, and that has been replicated in 2011. So there is a huge potential there. And in terms what I mean by land readjustment to collective relocation is that if this was the old settlement in 1995, what they did was redesign the whole settlement layout and to have wider streets, grid-like, more space for outdoor evacuation, and just readjusted the land. And people would have been moved away from each other. However, if now what the government does is they don't just readjust the existing site, but relocate people away from a hazardous site, but also keep people, allow them to choose their neighbors. So to end, disasters do provide an opportunity for improving the well-being of the people, reduce susceptibility of the house itself to withstand future natural hazards, as well as change the whole development culture. And what does that? What helps pivot or turn towards that systemic change? One is the goodwill of government. Without that, nothing would happen that large scale. Government also having a governance system, and coordinating with diverse actors such that it allows, it works with the strengths of all stakeholders. Proactive planning. If you start thinking after a disaster where to relocate people, and whether where they are is safe or not, it would take much longer to rebuild. However, if there are plans already of hazard risk, then it becomes much faster. And improving building standards while also incorporating indigenous technologies, like was done in case of two Indian case studies. Community-centered approach, even in developed countries such as Japan, that came as a sticking point where people were unhappy about. So it happens quite naturally in context of India, which is highly populous and has lower financial resources. It didn't happen naturally in context of Japan, and the government is learning how to do it better. Centrality of assistance package, even in context of developed countries such as Japan, private owners also needed assistance. In case of India, the need of assistance package was huge because of a lot of poverty and lack of land rights. But lastly, and not the least, sustained capacity building. Without sustaining over time, and once again, the importance of the temporal dimension in disaster studies, without sustaining that risk awareness, building capacity of the builders, supporting them to apply those skills in the construction, future construction, proactive risk incorporation into any planning of a bridge or an airport or where the new development happens. Without that sustained efforts, and that's where this links to 5.1, the leading role of government, resilience cannot be built. So these are the catalyzing factors which we have included in, and that links to resilient recovery. And the decentralized setup of a shelter hub in context of India is a leading best practice example in the world. and what Japan is doing in terms of their technological understanding and now bringing in a bit of social participatory planning into their risk-based planning, urban planning, is also really interesting. The hindering factors, however, were sorry, my slides are stuck. Hindering factors were when government adopted a top-down recovery approach, which was the case after tsunami in context of Thailand. And mind you, within each case study, also there were a number of different approaches adopted within one state and one location. So we are only talking about our case study sites here. If there is a top-down recovery coordination and inadequate assistance, people don't recover. And that applies in developed countries as well as less developed countries. The heavy reliance on market-driven mechanisms in developed countries has not worked. And hence Japan had to change their policies to support private homeowners as well. In Australia also we have heavy reliance on market-driven mechanisms, and hazard type also matters. When it is a fire, bushfire, there's a lot of philanthropic funds that flows, and homeowners can have access to both their insurance money as well as additional philanthropic money. However, after floods, people even struggle to get insurance money. So the market-driven mechanisms are not as reliable. We need a multi-pronged approach to how to finance our housing reconstruction. And lastly, but not least, a lack of sustained capacity building. So no recovery and persistent vulnerability was evident in case of floods in Thailand. And India was one of best practice examples where after floods, government came up with a holistic housing recovery plan. Not just giving out some money to people and saying, you build what you want to build, my job is done. Rather said, we will give you a support, a whole group of 4 people will come and help you, guide you, an architect, an engineer, a social worker, and a finance person. They'll come and support you, and they will sign off that you have built a safe home. That doesn't usually happen in most developing countries. So there is insufficient response after floods, which is a massive hindering factor where vulnerability persists. So this framework is available on in our book, and finally re-articulating that there is limited research on long-term, past 7 years after a disaster, let alone 2 disasters within a country and cross-cultural comparison. The development discourse does intersect with disaster literature and housing challenges, and we have interwoven that in our first chapter to come up with a new housing systems framework. We have identified that social movement and the role and practice of CSOs is worth shining a light on. Without that, the implementation, reconstruction implementation, and without the sustained capacity building, resilient recovery is not possible. This is a deterritorial across different culture book and insights. Should you wish to get a copy, you please use this code to get a 20% discount. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mittul. That was very, very extensive work that you have done there over 5 years. We do appreciate the work you have done. Thank you for your presentation. And while we are expecting our audience to send questions, I'll start by, giving you, slowly what you wade you into the question. One of my question is looking at the extensive work that you have done, and I think one of the things I keep hearing from your presentation is that we should treat housing as an infrastructure rather than a shelter. Could you elaborate on what this means in practical terms for government planners and recovery agencies, particularly in relation to policy design, funding, and regulation, and long-term maintenance?
Wow. It's a big question, but a really valid one, and something I've been pondering upon since we did a research with Ahuri on looking at similar, like two disasters within each Australian state, and we examined 5 states within Australia. What does it mean? We do see housing as a physical asset, like again coming back to Australian context, and an economic asset. It's seen as an investment property to gain more capital, and whereas many are left behind, not being able to afford a single home to for themselves. So whether so we've been discussing with the Australian standards to see how can we support more Indigenous and alternative materials, and they are currently looking at hemp and seeing how that can be introduced for bushfire safety. But it goes through a long process before it is allowed as per the Australian standards. So certain knowledges and social understanding is seen as lower quality, versus others are seen as best quality. And that's what we do with countries as well, that this is more developed and high income, and this is low developed and lower development country. We're doing the same with house, we're doing the same with knowledge. And so I feel that a country's skills, their building sectors, understanding of how to construct is they both like the material aspects are the and the skill part are the pain points. In context of system, here we are not good at, like Japan, not good at having that social network, and that social and sense of community that a settlement allows, that only can be accommodated by some different kind of design. In case of Gujarat, India, you would have seen there were clustered houses. Europe has that clustered medium density house. So the physical can have effect on the social, and the material can have an impact on the skills. What materials are considered as allowable by the Australian standards will have impact on skills. So I feel it's a vicious loop, but the physical does have an impact on the social and the political. Does that make sense or answer your question?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're trying to say in terms of you looked at it from the idea of a round loop that if we have to treat it as infrastructure, then we have to provide the skills, the alternative materials has to be there, it has to be backed up by regulations and standard, which I kind of understand. Before I ask a follow-up question, I think I've seen Ifti. You want to ask a question? You can use your mic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Mittul. That was a fantastic presentation. Great. Uh, Look, I just have a very quick point, and I think we all know it is a fairly obvious point. the point is that money,
Mm.
right? Where's the money coming from? A house, in whatever context, whether you're talking about in low-income village in India or in high-income, settlement in Australia, is the most expensive commodity a person usually owns if they can own one. But if you look at the countries that you look at, Thailand, Japan, India, and even Australia for that matter, you'll find that there's very little financing available for recovery reconstruction housing. Nowhere. And in India and other countries, you can give the excuse, yeah, they don't have enough resources and stuff like that. But what are we doing here? Where do people actually go and dip their hand into and pull out some money and say, like, look, I need this to repair my home? Insurance, yes, of course, but insurance is also limited in a certain ways. And so, I mean, I'm not saying that there should be handouts, but there should be some sort of strategic mechanism that allows people to access financial resources for rebuilding after disasters. So I think that is an area not much covered in the literature. It's something, Mittul, we have been working together for the last 20 years or so. So I think it's the same quintessential question. Where is the money coming from?
Mm. Absolutely. Cannot add anything further to what you've said. Absolutely. That's the biggest pain point. It's in the Ahuri report, what we were looking for world best practice in assistance package as well. And I wouldn't say this is the best practice, the one I'm going to share. However, what FEMA, the US model, what they have done is FEMA provides insurance to those who cannot afford to have insurance otherwise. And there is room for government to create such a fund, which I know there are talks of right now, because majority of people are not able to have an insurance. They're living in highly flood risk areas and they cannot move, and government cannot support buyback for all. So yes, that is the biggest pain point. But that FEMA approach, and that's what I meant, we need a multi-pronged approach to how we fund reconstruction. And let's do it in a way that the houses don't fall down next time. And insurance companies are not ready to pay for betterment, and they will only pay for like. We know that. And hence, what Japan does is, and has done in the past, is they asked other states, other what are they called? The provinces who were not affected by certain disaster or calamity to pay 5% or whatever tax. And that went into rebuilding of those who were affected. So there were different mechanisms government have adopted around the world to support that. In case of India, they took massive loan from the World Bank to support the poor in reconstruction and gave little, also supported private owners, but they had to have criteria of how much support they gave whom. So, of course, that's not the best option because then the government has a loan hanging on them forever. But there is a parametric insurance that is being trialed in France, which is the parameters are predefined for the insurance company to support whoever is affected based on those criteria. And that is something at the cutting edge, which might be the way to go for developed countries around the world, who are quite reliant on insurance as a market-driven mechanism.
Actually, I'll just add one quick point, Temi, and I'll stop. It's just a very interesting, very recent approach that they've been trying is called disaster savings. So many of these countries, even in developed countries, they have microcredit programs. And through that program, they can have a disaster fund and especially in areas which are prone to recurring disasters. So they put a little bit of money every month so that if they're caught in a disaster afterwards, they have a little kitty from which they can take out money. And even if they go into default, they can, reimburse it and eventually build up that fund. So there are ways of addressing it. But this is brand new stuff. People don't talk about housing finance. It's just insurance, or you find it on your own way. The government, if the government is kind enough. So these are the three main options. None of them seem to be working great. So, if you look at the recent Tsunami Trust Fund report, which just came out today by UNSCAP, you see that there's a lot of investment on things like early warning systems, evacuation, all that, very little for the housing sector. And yet the housing sector is the most devastated, most severely affected sector. So none of them, they don't want to touch housing because it's so expensive. And they're floundering for ideas on how to actually fund recovery. So,
Yeah.
okay, I'll stop. I promise. Thanks, Kemi.
You're right. And it's very complex, right? Because there is land rights involved. Donors wouldn't work with people who don't have land rights. And they need to think about where are the pipes going to come into the house before they start building it. So that's why it exists within a broader system, and hence infrastructure, housing as infrastructure, what you said, Temi, which I'm saying housing as a system within a system. It is absolutely crucial to frame it and see it that way, and see that without financing that, everything else cannot exist.
Thank you so much, Ifti. Thank you, Mittul. Do we have questions in the house? We are running behind schedule. Anyone? Okay, thank you very much, Mittul. I will send my questions to you. I think we need to move forward now. And thank you for your presentation. And we are glad to be, learning from you from a decade of work that you have done in Asia. Thank you so much. So while we're still here, I just want to do a bit of announcement. Next slide. We're running a special issue. Is not coming up? Okay, sorry, we're having a technical issue here with the slides. But just to let you know that we are having a special issue with environmental hazard journal. It's a Q1 journal. So members of W120, which I believe are all in this presentation today, are welcome to send their papers. So it's a Q1, very highly professional as well, for a practice focused. So we are encouraging anyone here who wants to participate to please, take up this opportunity to participate. And then I want to use this opportunity again to announce our next webinar. Next one, we're having a webinar, which is looking at activating local community infrastructure for disaster resilience, lessons learned from Indonesia. We're looking at what Indonesia has done in the wake of the last few recent disasters they've had, to learn from their own experience and what they've done in real time. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time. We know time is money. And I also want to say a final thank you to Mittul for doing this wonderful presentation. And congratulations again on your book. It's finally done. We appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your time today and for joining us. Have a good evening, and we'll see you again next month on our monthly webinar series. Thank you everyone. Have a good evening.